the highest level of quality service in the areas of regulatory compliance, product testing, safety assessments, product quality control and assurance, and product inspections. I will now turn this over to Christy and Sue.
Great. Hi, everyone. This is Christy. Thank you, Krista, for your introduction, and welcome to our session. As Krista mentioned, we'll be discussing recent state regulation and some notable trends that we're seeing, as well as how to navigate and prepare for these new requirements. So first, we'll talk about the developing regulatory trends. Then we will look at some recent updates in more detail. We will cover topics including chemicals of concern or COC restrictions in children's products. We'll cover model toxics and packaging legislation updates, some recent flame retardant restrictions, and then other recent updates regarding persistent bioaccumulative and toxic or PBT chemicals in consumer products. From there, we will provide some recommendations for how manufacturers and brands can continue to create compliant products. So there are two groups of chemicals that are addressed in most of the recently passed state legislation. The first group includes the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and these are also commonly referred to as PFAS. PFAS are used in consumer products for their stain and water repellent, as well as non-stick properties. And they can commonly be found in non-stick cookware, plant fiber-based single-use food serviceware, food packaging, carpeting, leather, and apparel items. And these chemicals are also present in firefighting foams, and this is where we first started seeing legislation developed for this class of chemicals. The second group is flame retardants. Flame retardants are found in upholstered furniture, mattresses, and other textile and foam products around the home. And the next thing we want to talk about is why are we seeing these chemicals regulated so much at the state level? And to kind of dive into this a little bit more, we look at recent restrictions in the consumer product industry at the global level. And the EU has regulated PFAS in consumer products under the EU POPs regulation and other regulations over time. Additionally, countries such as China and Japan are also restricting these chemicals in consumer products by including them in their restricted substances lists. In the US, although manufacturing of PFAS has been phased out, consumer products imported from other countries still contain these chemicals. So now the US states are also beginning to regulate PFAS in consumer products for a number of reasons. Similar trends are also notable when looking at the restriction of flame retardants. And most recently, flame retardant restrictions are limiting the use of a broad group of organohalogen flame retardants in consumer products. So both groups of chemicals, flame retardants and PFAS, are linked to a variety of potential health concerns, including cancer, reproductive and neurological toxicity. And the health concerns continue to grow because these chemicals are persistent and bioaccumulative. And this means that they don't break down in the environment. So as a result, they're found in a variety of food chains, drinking water, and then eventually they accumulate in our bodies as well. So efforts to reduce contamination from sources such as firefighting foams have brought these harmful chemicals into the regulatory spotlight, and they are now subject to further restriction because of their known toxicity. Beyond PFAS and flame retardants, we're also seeing a number of states increase restrictions that cover large groups of chemicals of concern, mostly in children's products. And these chemicals of concern sometimes include flame retardants and PFAS as well. So based on this trend, what do we expect to come next, right? States are more agile and able to enact legislation quicker than the federal government, so it's likely that this trend will continue into the near future. But recently, we are seeing the restriction of some PBTs in consumer products. even at the federal level under the EPA's Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. And because TSCA requires a continuous number of substances to be reviewed, it is expected that these similar product-focused restrictions will continue again at the federal level and hopefully preempting further state-level regulation. So the first regulatory update we'll look into in detail is the Oregon Toxic Free Kids Act. Oregon has recently implemented phase 3, and in this phase, children's cosmetics, children's products intended to be placed in the mouth, and products intended for children under 3 years of age will be subject to further requirements. So as early as January 2022, high priority chemicals must either be 1, removed, 2, substituted with an alternative, or 3, granted a waiver by the authority. So I do want to specifically mention that the deadline may vary for each manufacturer or retailer, because the date on which the CHCCs should be removed or substituted is the date that the manufacturer would have to report that high priority chemical for the 3rd time in that same product. So this was clarified by communications with the Oregon DEC. So, to further clarify, if a company has been reporting a particular CHCC in a covered product since 2017, those CHCCs should be removed or substituted prior to that January 22 reporting date. Sorry, 2022, excuse me. Moving on, New York State recently passed legislation that includes both reporting and restriction requirements to restrict chemicals of concern in children's products. Beginning January 1st, 2023, intentionally added asbestos, benzene, and TDC-PP will be banned in children's products. Additionally, a list of COCs is currently being established by the New York State DEC. And the list must be created by March 1st, 2022, and then enforcement of the reporting requirement will begin 12 months after the list is created. Under this requirement, chemicals of concern, or COCs, are defined as chemicals that are carcinogen, reproductive, or developmental toxicant, neurotoxicant, or endocrine disruptor. The New York State DEC is currently reviewing and considering chemicals included in other state hazardous chemical lists for inclusion on this list of COCs. High priority chemicals, or HPCs, are chemicals that meet the COC criteria we just talked about and are also found in humans, the home environment, wildlife, and or banned in other states due to their known negative health effects. HPCs are also expected to be reported when used in children's products and will be considered for further restriction. During a recent virtual public meeting discussing the regulation writing for this, it was noted that the industry leaders are trying to push to keep this New York regulation more in alignment with other similar state regulations such as Washington and Oregon. For example, there's a push for contaminants to be permitted at 100 parts per million rather than being limited to the PQL limit or practical quantitation limit as the legislation is currently written. Okay, Washington State also has had some progress in recent, legislation. The Safer Products for Washington Act has established a framework over the last few years in which it can regulate harmful chemicals in certain consumer products. Phase 1 created the list of priority chemicals. Phase 2 was implemented on June 1st, 2020, and in that phase, priority products were identified, and you can see those listed here. The next phases will include the restriction of these chemicals in the listed products. So restriction via rulemaking could be established as early as June 1st, 2023. Also not listed here on the slide, but it's worth mentioning that in a similar framework, California has also adopted carpets and rugs containing PFAS as a priority product. And this means that these products are not permitted if they contain PFAS for distribution in California. The Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse, or TPCH, is an organization that maintains the toxics and packaging legislation and then coordinates the implementation of state legislation on behalf of its member states. So in recent months, the TPCH introduced updated requirements actually back in February 2021, and these new requirements include phthalates and PFAS. Now, in addition to the original 4 heavy metals, which were lead, cadmium, mercury, and hexavalent chromium. Now, each individual state would have to adopt changes to its current laws or adopt a new law entirely prior to enforcement to occur in that state. So what we have to do now is just watch the individual state legislation to see how this progresses. As discussed earlier, flame retardants are a group of persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals that have been subject to some recent restrictions through state regulatory action. Here we talk about a few recent flame retardant updates. In Massachusetts, listed flame retardants will be restricted in children's products, bedding, carpeting, furniture, and window treatments starting December 31st this year. In California, there are a few recent flame retardant bans that are currently in effect, and there's the statewide ban of the flame retardants in juvenile products, mattresses, and upholstered furniture. And also prior to that, in 2019, San Francisco began the restriction of flame retardants in upholstered furniture and certain children's products. Nevada has passed legislation restricting the use of organohalogen flame retardants in certain consumer products, and this comes into effect starting July 1st, 2022. These new requirements cover children's products, upholstered residential furniture, mattresses, and textiles used in window and wall coverings. Manufacturers and retailers are restricted from both producing and selling products with over 1,000 parts per million of these chemicals. So in this legislation, covered chemicals include organohalogenated chemicals and that are also flame retardants. So organohalogenated chemicals are defined as any chemical that contains one or more carbon element and one or more halogen elements. So in alignment with other recent regulation, it's clear that this definition kind of leads to a group of covered chemicals being regulated instead of just a small list of organohalogen flame retardants. So again, kind of going along with that trend. Some more interesting things to note here when defining a children's product. This requirement specifically excludes toys that are covered under ASTM F963. It also excludes electronic consumer products, tents and sleeping bags, as well as other outdoor sports equipment. And the legislation clarifies that manufacturing and sale prohibitions do not apply to previously owned products that are resold. They also don't apply to children's products, mattresses, and upholstered residential furniture or residential textiles for which there is a federal or national flammability standard already established. And we're trying to get more clarification from them at this point as to what products they're really trying to incorporate into that. But at this point, we're still waiting to hear back. There are additional exclusions in the legislation under Section 24, so this section should be reviewed against the details of your product line to determine the true impact of this new requirement for your company. So Additionally, this law also prohibits the replacement of organohalogenated flame retardants with any other chemical that's known or suspected to be harmful. Okay. Moving on to cover some recent PFAS regulatory updates. In recent years, states have enacted legislation to restrict PFAS in firefighting foam, regulate the presence of PFAS in drinking water, food packaging, and consumer products. There's also a focus on the allocation of funds for cleanup and remediation, among other measures, with the intentions of reducing the negative impact of these chemicals on our communities. The more recent restrictions cover products such as disposable food packaging and cosmetics. PFAS restrictions are also regularly included in COC legislation for children's products. For example, Vermont and Maine both recently updated their CHCC lists to include additional PFAS chemicals. Okay. More drastic action has been taken to regulate PFAS chemicals in Maine with the passing of Bill LD 1503. And this legislation includes a ban of all products with intentionally added PFAS chemicals by January 1st, 2030. Until 2030, Maine will continue to restrict categories of consumer products with intentionally added PFAS based on, how likely they are to cause contamination of the state's land or water resources. So starting January 1st, 2023, carpets and rugs, as well as fabric treatments with intentionally added PFAS will be banned. Also from the state, it will be required that any consumer product that has intentionally added PFAS is reported by the manufacturer to the state of Maine. So there's this reporting requirement that's going along with this too. The reported information should include the product's description, the purpose for adding PFAS, the amount of PFAS present, and then also the manufacturer's company address and contact information. So the trend continues, because there are a number of states with newly proposed PFAS legislation as well. These include Iowa and Rhode Island and many others. So now that we've kind of looked at an overview of the recent regulatory restrictions at the state level, I will turn this over to Sue so she can share some recommendations for how to address these ever-changing restrictions.
Thank you, Christy. There is certainly a lot going on with regards to the U.S. state and chemical restrictions. And as you mentioned, it's just going to continue. I think you can move to the next slide, please. It is a lot for manufacturers and for other companies to keep track of. I know that you and Kima's technical team monitor these closely. And we're only talking US state legislation. We're not even mentioning Europe and other regions' chemical requirements. So as Christy mentioned, I wanted to just talk about some general recommendations for navigating the regulations, ways that companies can assess the compliance of their products. So the first step really should be to review your product line and determine if the product even falls within the scope of the various state laws. And if you move on to the next slide, Christy, really, does your product even meet the definition of a children's product as defined in the regulation? And if it does, is your specific children's product covered by, say, the Washington State Children's Safe Product Act? Because that law uses product categories based on the GS1 Global Product Classification System. Not all children's products are covered. I remember when the Washington state law first came out, I was working with a large backpack manufacturer, and they were really concerned about compliance until they realized that the backpacks were not included in the bricks, those categories of product that are covered by the Washington state legislation. And, we know that California's Safer Consumer Products program is looking to add children's product as a category for which they may then propose a product chemical combination, which would make it a regulated priority product. So it may be that children's products become regulated, but even so, it may only be certain chemicals in certain types of children's products. Speaking of California, Prop 65, yes, covers all products, over 900 chemicals. As we know, it's not even just products, but also facilities and environments as well. So Prop 65 will apply to your products and may require a warning. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to address that. So really, an obvious question too is, are you even selling or distributing your product in a certain state that has chemical legislation? If you are, you may want to, moving on to the next recommendation, is to create or use a restricted substances list, an RSL. And really, an RSL in its simplest form is a list of chemicals restricted in consumer products, usually due to government regulation or law. And the purpose of an RSL is to reduce the use of hazardous substances in consumer goods. So you can use an industry RSL, such as the one that AAFA, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, publishes. They recently published their 22nd edition, and it's focused on apparel and footwear and home textiles based on global regulations and laws and bans for those types of products. Then many big multinational companies have their own RSLs, which are publicly available. These include, but are no means limited to, the companies that are listed here. Or you can create your own RSL, one that's more specific to your products and your companies and your risk levels. So you can refer to US state laws, including those we've just discussed here. You can also look at industry standards that may not fully apply to your product, but that you may want to include in your RSL. So for example, ASTM F963 is specific to toys, but you could certainly incorporate the heavy metals limits from that standard into your RSL, as well as the phthalates restrictions. And you can look globally at Europe's REACH legislation, and their substances of very high concern. At EN 71 Part 3, the European Toy Safety Standard, which includes additional heavy metals. If you have electronics, there are RoHS restrictions, the restrictions of hazardous substances. So it's not that hard to create your own RSL. I know that we've worked with some of our clients to help them develop an appropriate RSL and to keep it updated, which is critical as the regulations change frequently, as Christy talked about. Then moving on to options to assess compliance to the applicable state legislation and to your RSL if you have one. Some companies use supplier declarations or letters of attestation. So if you're a retailer or distributor of a product, you may require some type of written confirmation from your manufacturer. If you're a manufacturer, you may require something from your factory and/or the raw material suppliers. Some of the declarations I've seen are as vague as a statement on company letterhead that says that all of our products or materials comply with all US state legislation and do not require warnings or reporting. This type of statement, in my opinion, does not provide much confidence. Other declarations are more product or material specific, so they should specify the product or the material that they're providing to you. They should list the applicable laws and regulations that they're declaring compliance to. And if reporting is required based on the presence of certain chemicals, those details should be included in that supplier declaration. If warnings are required based on the presence of certain chemicals, these should be noted too. And I know a lot of companies have a specific format for supplier declarations. And so really, any of these declarations show at least a minimum level of due diligence. Whether or not they're sufficient is up to you. So I want to move on to some other options, which can be used in conjunction with the RSL and with these declarations. So another way to assess compliance with the various state chemical laws is to request and review the bill of substances. This is not the bill of materials, which lists each unique component that goes into making the final product, but rather it's a more detailed list of chemicals, including the CAS numbers that make up each component. The listed chemicals can then be reviewed to determine if any of the chemicals are included in any of the state lists of chemicals of high concern, or those chemicals that have specific limits or bans. It is a bit laborious, yes. Some technical expertise may be needed, so you may want to outsource this review to your lab partner or to a toxicologist. There are some automated systems that can perform this type of review with the proper input. And then, of course, performing chemical testing on a product or its components is a valid way to assess compliance and identify any warning or reporting requirements. To test for all restricted chemicals would be cost prohibitive. It's not necessary and perhaps not even possible when you consider something like Prop 65's 900 plus chemicals. So a screening test can be performed for the various CHCC lists of the various state requirements. Most labs have test packages for this type of testing. And the screening would identify if a restricted chemical is present, but not necessarily the actual amount of the chemical or the migratable amount, but it's a start, it's a screening. Testing based on risk assessment takes into account the materials used in the product and then the chemicals that may be present in those materials, because not all materials are going to contain all of the restricted chemicals. So why would you test a metal component, for example, for azo dyes or flame retardant? You do need knowledge of materials and chemicals to perform the risk assessment. And so again, you may want to consult with your test lab partner or a toxicologist when determining which testing is most appropriate. And for Prop 65, many companies test based on the settlements of similar products. It's interesting, I recently participated in a webinar about Prop 65, and the speaker advised that 93% of the settlements cover only 10 chemicals out of the 900 plus on the Prop 65 list. And of these, 65% were for lead and phthalates. So KEMA maintains a searchable database of settlements for the types of products that our customers manufacture. And this helps us with the risk assessment in determining which are the high-risk materials and which are the chemicals that should be tested on those materials. So now you've confirmed which state laws apply to your product. You've assessed what chemicals are in your product, whether through supplier declarations, bill of substances review, and/or testing. And so now you may need to do some reporting to one or more of the states. There is a hierarchy in certain state laws as to who needs to report. You know, is it the actual manufacturer, unless they don't have a US presence, the importer who brought the product into the US, or the distributor in the US? And there may be unique requirements related to which chemicals require reporting. So in Maine, for example, priority chemicals require reporting, but you also need to be aware of the chemicals of high concern. In Oregon, reporting's required for both accessible and inaccessible materials. So there's a lot of nuances in the various laws. There are some automated software systems available that you can enter your chemical information into, and the system may be able to upload the information to certain state reporting sites. So I show one here, IC2. Their database allows you to file children's product reports for states such as Washington and Oregon. And it is possible that your lab partner may do the reporting for you. I know that we do some for some of our major clients just as an added service. All of these requirements, I just want to step back a little bit, but all of the requirements really point to the need to know what chemicals are in your products, and it's also important to know what chemicals are in your manufacturing facilities, because there may be a potential for contamination from the chemicals that are used in the facility, but that aren't intentionally added to the product. The contaminants could affect the compliance of your product as well as the need to report. Remember that many of the state laws do include limits for contaminants. Just as an example, years ago, we tested wet inks before they were screen printed onto shirts for lead content. And they passed, no lead detected. We then tested the printed decoration on the shirts, and we found high levels of lead. And come to find out, the screens used in the screen printing were cleaned periodically, as they should be, but with leaded gasoline. So there was a chemical you really wouldn't want to see in your factory. So the first shirts printed after the screens were cleaned showed unacceptable levels of lead. You know, other examples where product contamination may occur include mold release agents, solvents added to paints and other materials, unclean storage containers, unapproved materials getting mixed in, oil used in injector pins. So there's any number of chemicals and ways that the finished product could get contaminated, which is why you want to make sure your factory has a robust chemical management program. It can help minimize the risk of contamination. You know, they should review the chemical inventory, identify which chemicals could result in non-compliance or contamination, ensure that the chemicals are properly stored, use only approved chemical suppliers. And I know this really gets down to the factory level, but a robust chemical management program can be part of a factory's overall quality management system and can help you avoid receiving contaminated product. So even when you have compliance to current state regulations under control, you should be considering safer alternatives, at least for any of the chemicals that you had to report or warn against. And some states are going to require this for certain types of products. Oregon, for example, as Christy advised, will not allow high priority chemicals to be used as of January 1st, 2022 for children's cosmetics and items for children under 3 years of age and children's products that are mouthable. So how do you find safer alternatives? I remember when lead in children's jewelry was raised as a significant concern, some manufacturers substituted cadmium for the lead. This was not a safer alternative. So there are databases that can help you determine if the chemical you're considering presents a known hazard. The databases listed here come from Washington's Department of Ecology website, and there are others. Then you can look for existing chemical hazard assessments on the safer alternatives that you're considering. So the first two sources listed here include existing chemical hazard assessments. The last two provide tools to help you conduct your own chemical hazard assessment. After you've identified the chemicals of concern by screening data or by using existing chemical hazard assessments, then you can conduct an alternatives assessment. recommend using a toxicologist for this assessment, because it's not just the material, but it also needs to take into consideration many other factors, such as exposure, the use of the product and the user, the purpose of the chemicals, why are they including these chemicals. And the alternatives assessment is intended to prevent the use of a regrettable substitution, replacing a chemical with one that has worse or unknown toxic effects. And it may not even need to be a chemical. Perhaps there's another innovative way to achieve the same goal without using a chemical when you're looking to remove certain hazardous chemicals from your product. I do think that requiring the use of safer alternatives for certain chemicals of concern is likely to become more common. And so, as we can see from Christy's discussion, these state laws continue to evolve. New ones are introduced. There are changes to current ones. We all need to stay informed. And there are several resources available to keep you informed. Not just of the state laws, but of other regulatory and safety information in the consumer products industry. Third-party laboratories are a valuable resource in keeping up to date on regulations and legislation that may affect your products. So included here is a link to KEMA's monthly regulatory recaps, which you can sign up to receive each month free of charge. And other labs have similar monthly newsletters. You can sign up to receive regulatory recall notices. I included a link to the CPSC recall database here. And saferproducts.gov includes reports of harm or potential harm, as well as actual recalls. You can also sign up for Europe's SafetyGate recalls, those from Health Canada. And I know those are not focusing specifically on US state legislation, but it's important as a general practice to know about issues with products similar to yours. And the European recalls in particular are often based on chemicals, some of which may not be yet regulated in the United States, but they may be coming. And then there's organizations like saferstates.org that provide great information on the state legislation. It includes a bill tracker. The OEHA site for Prop 65. We subscribe to the Prop 65 Clearinghouse to help stay informed on Prop 65. Industry associations such as AAFA, PPAI, JPMA, the Toy Association provide resources for their members to stay informed, and they represent industry members with the legislators. And then, of course, there's safety conferences such as ICFSO, the International Consumer Product Health and Safety Organization, and other conferences and summits that are put on by the industry organization. So that completes the presentation portion, and we welcome any questions.
Thank you both for this informative presentation. You can continue to type any questions in the question area on the panel. The first question I have here is, what else is the federal government doing to address these chemicals?
I can take that one, Sue.
Yeah.
So EPA has had some recent restriction. This is for the consumer product realm. For PBT chemicals, those persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals that we talked a little bit about. And this does restrict importation of these chemicals in articles or those consumer products. Also, I know the EPA has updated a recent SNR, or I forget what that stands for, on PFAS specifically, so that articles containing PFAS as a coating or in carpets and rugs cannot be imported into the US without proper EPA review. Trying to think about organohalogen flame retardants.
I think, the CPSC really has been conducting research on how to determine like what approach to use when regulating these chemicals in consumer products. They published a guidance document as well, I want to say back in maybe 2017. But currently, I don't think there are any restrictions for the use of organohalogen flame retardants at the federal level. But recently, I recall the EPA has taken some action under TSCA to support the CPSC's efforts here with organohalogen flame retardants. And they're basically, it comes down to just increasing their efforts to get more data on the health effects at class level. And most of this information is going to come from unpublished research that manufacturers are receiving. But that's.
Yep. Wouldn't it be nice to have the federal government have the regulations, and then each individual state wouldn't necessarily have to look to create their own, because that just makes a huge patchwork of requirements that may differ from state to state.
Right.
Okay, thank you. The next one I have here is, can you tell me more about how my company should comply with Cal Prop 65?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So as I mentioned, a lot of companies look to the settlements of products similar to theirs to assess compliance to Prop 65. And really, any of the tools that I talked about can be used for Prop 65. So you can look at the bill of substances. You can request an attestation. You can do testing, appropriate testing. So maybe test based on the settlements. I know in the beginning, or a few years ago, some companies just chose to include the warning, the Prop 65 warning, but that got a little tricky with the changes in, I think it was 2018, when you had to actually list a chemical. And I think OEHA was trying to do away with just people putting a vague warning on everything. So really, I would suggest knowing what chemicals are in your product, maybe getting that declaration, which is a piece of paper, and then seriously looking at the settlements and doing informed testing based on chemicals that have been involved in settlements of products similar to yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sue. It looks like we have time for one more question. Have any states adopted the new PFAS and phthalate requirements for model toxics in packaging?
That one I can take. So far, if I remember correctly, I think most of the updated packaging requirements are specific to food packaging that I'm seeing at the state level. So these do include PFAS and phthalates, but each state is, enacting different legislation. I know I've seen some changes in Vermont and Connecticut and some others, and then most include PFAS. Pretty sure some include phthalates as well, but I just can't recall there.
Okay. Well, that is all the time that we have today for our webinar. We would like to thank Christy and Sue and everyone who joined today. If we were unable to answer your question, we will respond back to you directly. And if you do have any additional questions, please email info@kema.com. The recording of this webinar will be emailed to everyone within the next few days. And we do hope you can join us again for our future webinars, which can be found at www.kema.com/webinar. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.